The island of Crete sits in the Mediterranean Sea like a great stone ship, anchored in deep, turquoise waters. In the spring of 1941, specifically in May, the island was not a place of vacation or leisure, but a holding pen for exhausted men. The British, Australian, and New Zealand troops, collectively known as Force, had just arrived from the disastrous campaign in mainland Greece. They had been evacuated by the Royal Navy under the cover of darkness, leaving behind their heavy equipment, their trucks, their tanks, and in many cases, their personal kit. They arrived on Crete tired, their uniforms stained with the dust of defeat, their eyes hollow from weeks of retreating under the relentless harassment of the German Luftwaffe. To understand the atmosphere on the island in those early weeks of May, you must imagine the heat. It was not yet the blistering furnace of high summer, but the sun was bright and constant. The landscape of Crete is rugged, a spine of limestone mountains running east to west, dropping down into valleys filled with ancient olive groves and vineyards, eventually flattening out into narrow coastal strips where the airfields were located. It was a landscape that smelled of wild thyme, sage, and goat manure, a dry, earthy scent that would soon be mixed with the acrid stench of cordite and burning fuel. The soldiers were digging in. That is what soldiers do when they stop moving. But on Crete, the digging was hard. The ground was rocky, a thin layer of soil over hard stone. And there were very few tools. Thousands of entrenching tools had been abandoned on the beaches of mainland Greece. Men used steel helmets to scrape at the earth, or the lids of corned beef tins, trying to fashion shallow slip trenches beneath the twisted shade of the olive trees. They were waiting for an attack, but few could have imagined the form it would take. The intelligence was there, largely thanks to the intercepts known as Ultra, which gave the Allied commander, General Bernhard Freyberg, a distinct advantage. He knew the Germans were coming by air. He knew they planned an airborne assault. But knowing an invasion is coming and visualizing the sheer scale of a vertical envelopment are two very different things. Across the water in occupied Greece, the German war machine was coiling its springs. This was to be Operation Mercury. It was the brainchild of General Kurt Student, the commander of the German airborne forces, the Fallschirmjäger. These were the elite of the Wehrmacht. They were young, highly trained, physically fit, and indoctrinated with a belief in their own invincibility. They had seen success in the Low Countries and in France. They believed that they could seize an island entirely from the air, a feat never before attempted in the history of warfare. The plan relied on speed, shock, and the overwhelming power of the Luftwaffe to suppress the defenders while the transport planes, the sturdy tri-motored Junkers 52, ferried waves of paratroopers and gliders to the target zones. The targets were the airfields. On the northern coast of Crete, the terrain is dictated by the mountains, forcing the towns and the infrastructure to hug the sea. From west to east, the key points were the airfield at Malim, the harbor town of Suda Bay, the town of Retimo, and the capital, Heraklion. General Student intended to drop his men on all these points, overwhelming the defenders with simultaneous assaults. It was a high-risk gamble. If the defenders held the airfields, the Germans would not be able to land reinforcements or heavy supplies. The paratroopers, lightly armed with submachine guns and grenades, would be cut off and annihilated. On the night of May the 19th, a strange quiet settled over the island. The men of the New Zealand Division, dug in around the Malim airfield and the village of Platanias, ate their rations in the twilight. They cleaned their rifles, the sturdy Lee Enfields that were the backbone of the infantry. They checked their ammunition pouches, feeling the weight of the brass cartridges. There was a tension in the air, a static charge that seemed to make the very hairs on their arms stand up. Many of them wrote letters home, scribbling on crinkled paper by the light of the moon, letters that would perhaps never be sent. They spoke of the beauty of the island, of the kindness of the Cretan civilians who offered them wine and cheese despite having so little themselves, and they spoke of the waiting. The morning of May the 20th, 1941, dawned clear and perfect. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. The sun rose over the white mountains, casting long shadows through the olive groves. In the camps, the routine of the morning began. Men shaved using cold water in mess tins. Cooks prepared tea, the sweet, milky tea that fueled the British Army. In the majestic calm of that Mediterranean morning, it felt for a fleeting moment as if the war was far away. But at shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, the silence was shattered, not by the gentle hum of insects, but by the roar of engines. It began with the bombing. The Luftwaffe arrived with a ferocity that shook the ground. Dornier 17 bombers and Messerschmitt 109 fighters swept low over the Allied positions. They strafed the olive groves, the bullets kicking up spurts of red dust. They dropped heavy bombs on the anti-aircraft positions, attempting to blind the defenders and silence the guns. The noise was deafening, a physical weight that pressed down on the men huddled in their shallow trenches. The ground heaved and shuddered. Dust rose in great choking clouds, obscuring the sun, turning the bright morning into a gray, hazy twilight. Then came the Stukas, the Junkers 87 dive bombers, with their cranked wings and fixed landing gear resembling birds of prey. They plummeted from the sky at steep angles, their sirens, the Jericho trumpets, screaming a terrifying wail designed to break the morale of those below. They targeted the gun pits and the infantry concentrations around Malim and Suda Bay. The explosions were precise and devastating. Men curled into balls, pressing their faces into the dirt, praying to a god they might not have spoken to in years, just waiting for the storm to pass. And then, just as suddenly as the bombardment had reached its crescendo, the bombing stopped. The roar of the combat aircraft faded, drifting away to the north. A sudden, ringing silence returned to the battlefield, filled only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of burning brush. The dust hung in the air, thick and motionless. The defenders, those who were still alive, shook the dirt from their uniforms and peered over the lips of their trenches, their eyes stinging, their ears ringing. They looked up, expecting perhaps a second wave of bombers. What they saw instead was a sight that no soldier had ever seen before. From the north, coming over the sea, was a low, rhythmic thrumming sound, like a deep vibration in the chest. It grew louder, a slow, grinding mechanical pulse. Through the haze, shapes began to materialize. They were huge, lumbering transport planes, the Junkers 52, flying incredibly low, some only a few hundred feet above the water. There were hundreds of them. They stretched across the horizon like a plague of locusts, wingtip to wingtip, a dark armada blotting out the sun. But before the transports, there were the gliders. Silent, sleek shapes detached from their tow planes high above the sea and swooped down toward the island. These were the DFS-230 assault gliders, carrying the shock troops of the invasion. They whistled through the air, their long wings flexing, aiming for the dry riverbeds and the flat expanses of ground near the anti-aircraft guns and the Malim airfield. The New Zealanders, shaking off the shock of the bombardment, realized what was happening. Officers shouted orders, whistles blew, and the rattle of bolt-action rifles began to crackle along the defensive lines. The Bren light machine guns opened up, chattering rhythmically. The gliders came in fast. Some smashed into the rocky ground, splintering into matchwood, killing everyone inside instantly. Others clipped the tops of the olive trees, spinning wildly before crashing into the earth. But many landed successfully, skidding to a halt in clouds of dust. The doors were kicked open before the aircraft had even stopped moving, and out poured the German troops, gray-clad figures sprinting for cover, submachine guns blazing. But the main event was happening overhead. The slow-moving Junkers transports were now over the land. As the defenders looked up, they saw small dark objects falling from the bellies of the planes. For a second they looked like bombs. Then white, green, and camouflage canopies blossomed in the slipstream. Parachutes, thousands of them. The sky was suddenly filled with confetti, a surreal and terrifying spectacle. General Freiberg's men did not hesitate. They knew that a paratrooper is most vulnerable when he is in the air. He cannot take cover, he cannot effectively return fire. He is simply a man hanging in a harness, slowly descending into the sights of his enemy. The order went down the line, shoot them in the air. The sky turned into a shooting gallery. The roar of the transport planes was drowned out by the volume of ground fire. Thousands of rifles, machine guns, and anti-aircraft cannons turned their muzzles upward. The air was stitched with tracer rounds. Parachutes were shredded. Men slumped in their harnesses, dead before they ever touched the soil of Crete. It was a slaughter. The German doctrine called for dropping weapons in separate canisters to enable the paratrooper to jump with less weight, carrying only a pistol and a knife. This proved to be a fatal flaw. Those Germans who landed alive found themselves scrambling through the thorny brush, desperately searching for their weapons canisters, while the New Zealanders hunted them down with rifles and bayonets. Around the Maleme airfield, the fighting was particularly savage. The 22nd Battalion of the New Zealand Army, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, held the high ground overlooking the runway and the Tavernidis riverbed. They watched as the gliders landed in the dry riverbed below them. The Germans who scrambled out of the gliders immediately came under withered fire, but they were elite troops. They moved with speed and aggression, using the cover of the riverbanks to establish a foothold. They set up machine guns and began to suppress the New Zealand positions on the hill known as Hill 107. The chaos of battle is difficult to describe to those who have not seen it. It is not a clear chess match of units moving on a map. It is a fragmented, confusing, and terrifying mosaic of individual struggles. A soldier does not see the whole battle. He sees only the olive tree in front of him, the rock he is hiding behind, and the enemy soldier running through the vines 50 yards away. The noise is constant, the crack of bullets passing overhead, the thump of mortars, the screams of men calling for medics. On that morning in May, the heat began to rise, baking the ground, intensifying the thirst of the men who were fighting for their lives. To the east at Retimo and Heraklion, similar scenes were playing out. The German drops there were met with even fiercer resistance. The timing of the drops had been staggered, allowing the defenders at these locations to be fully alerted by the time the transport planes appeared. At Heraklion, the transport planes flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The slow, corrugated metal Junkers planes were torn apart. Some exploded in midair, raining burning debris and bodies onto the town and the harbor. Others crash-landed in the sea or on the beaches. The paratroopers who jumped were decimated. The Greek civilians, armed with old shotguns, farm tools, and knives, joined the Allied soldiers in hunting down the invaders. There was a primal ferocity to the defense. This was their island, their homes, and the Germans were falling into their backyards. Back at Maleme, the situation was becoming critical, though neither side fully realized it yet. The German assault had been a disaster in terms of casualties. The 7th Parachute Division, the pride of the Luftwaffe, was being bled white. Battalion commanders were dead, companies were scattered and leaderless. Groups of paratroopers, isolated and cut off, fought back-to-back in the olive groves, surrounded by angry defenders. If the Allies had launched a coordinated counterattack at that moment, in the early afternoon of May the 20th, the invasion might have been crushed right then and there. But the fog of war is thick. Communications were cut. Telephone lines had been severed by the bombing or by paratroopers cutting the wires. Radios were unreliable, struggling to transmit over the rugged terrain. Colonel Andrew, commanding the New Zealanders on Hill 107, could not see the full picture. He saw the Germans pressing up the hill from the riverbed. He saw his own men taking casualties. He tried to contact his headquarters to ask for support, to ask for the tanks that were held in reserve, but the coordination was slow and halting. The British Matilda tanks, heavy and slow, rumbled into the fray but found themselves blind in the dense olive groves, vulnerable to German anti-tank grenades and precise fire directed at their vision slits. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The heat remained intense. The thirst of the men was becoming a torture. Water bottles were empty, and moving to find a well meant risking a sniper's bullet. The smell of death was already beginning to permeate the air. In the olive groves, the bodies of German paratroopers lay tangled in their shrouds, looking like broken puppets dropped from a great height. The bodies of Allied soldiers lay slumped in their foxholes. General Student, sitting in his headquarters in the Hotel Grand Bretagne in Athens, waited anxiously for news. The reports coming back were fragmentary and alarming. Heavy resistance, commander killed, unable to secure objective. It seemed that his great gamble was failing. He had thrown his finest troops onto the island, and they were being massacred. The plan required the quick capture of Malim airfield so that the mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, could be flown in to reinforce the paratroopers. But Malim was still in Allied hands. The runway was swept by artillery and machine gun fire. No plane could land there. However, amidst the tactical failures, a small group of Germans had managed to establish a precarious hold on the western edge of the Malim airfield and in the Tavernidis riverbed. They were pinned down, exhausted, and running low on ammunition, but they were there. They were the toehold, and as the light began to fade on that first bloody day, the psychological strain on the defenders began to tell. Colonel Andrew on Hill 107 felt isolated. He could not see the other Allied units to his left and right. The aggressive patrolling of the surviving German paratroopers made him feel as though he was being surrounded. The lack of information bred fear. He looked down at the airfield which was his charge to protect, and he looked at his dwindling ammunition and his tired men. He had to make a decision. In the absence of clear orders and reinforcements, the instinct of a commander is often to preserve his force, to tighten the perimeter. Night falls quickly in the Mediterranean. One moment the sky is a bruised purple, and the next it is black. Under the cover of this darkness, the battlefield changed character. The noise of heavy firing died down, replaced by the pop of stray shots and the rustling of movement. It was a time for the wounded to be brought in, for ammunition to be redistributed, and for commanders to assess the damage. For the Germans scattered across the island, the night was a time of terror. They were deep in enemy territory, surrounded by a hostile population and a well-armed military force. They hid in ditches, in the ruins of farmhouses, and behind stone walls. They listened to the sounds of the English voices in the dark, clutching their submachine guns, waiting for the dawn which might bring either their salvation or their end. For the Allies, the night brought a different kind of anxiety. They had slaughtered the enemy, but they knew there were still Germans out there, and they knew that when the sun rose, the Luftwaffe would return. The psychological impact of the complete German air superiority cannot be overstated. The soldiers knew that as soon as the light returned, they would be pinned to the ground again, unable to move without bringing down the wrath of the Stukas. It was during this night, the night of May the 20th going into the 21st, that the turning point of the battle began to take shape, silently and invisibly. It was not a clash of arms, but a failure of communication and a collapse of confidence. Colonel Andrew, feeling the pressure on Hill 107, made a fateful decision. He decided to withdraw his battalion from the hill to a tighter defensive line further back. He believed he was being overrun. He did not know that the Germans facing him were in an even worse state, battered and on the verge of surrender. As the New Zealanders quietly pulled out of their foxholes and slipped away into the darkness, they left the key terrain feature, the hill that dominated the Malim airfield, empty. It was a ghost hill. The trenches were vacant. The machine gun posts were silent. The key to Crete lay on the ground, waiting for anyone brave enough to pick it up. The German commander in the riverbed, Oberst Sturm, did not realize this immediately. He was expecting a counterattack that would wipe his force out. He spent the night in anxious anticipation. But as the hours ticked by and no attack came, he sent scouts forward. They crept up the slopes of Hill 107, expecting to be cut down by machine gun fire at any moment. They moved from rock to rock, tree to tree. They reached the first line of trenches. Empty. They moved higher. Empty. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the peaks of the White Mountains on May the 21st, the Germans stood on the summit of Hill 107. They looked down at the Malim airfield. It was quiet. They fired a flare, a signal of success that seemed almost impossible given the carnage of the previous day. The airfield was theirs. The door to Crete had been pushed open, not by force of arms, but by the friction of war and the darkness of the night. Now the race was on. General Student in Athens acted with ruthless speed. He ordered the transports to launch immediately. He did not care about the debris on the runway or the lingering artillery fire from the Allies. He needed to get boots on the ground. The mountain troops, the 5th Mountain Division, were loaded into the Junkers 52 planes. They were not paratroopers, they were air-landing troops. They needed a runway. On the morning of Day 2, the sound of engines returned. The Allied soldiers, now repositioned further east, looked up with a sinking feeling. They saw the transport planes coming in low again. But this time they were not dropping men. They were lining up for the runway at Malim. The first plane came in hard. It bounced on the uneven ground, dodging the wrecks of gliders from the day before. It slewed to a halt and men poured out. Then the next one came. And the next. Some crashed. Some were hit by Allied artillery shells that were still within range, turning into fireballs on the tarmac. But for every plane that crashed, 2 more landed. The Germans were pouring reinforcements into the breach. They were pushing Junkers off the runway with bulldozers, sometimes pushing burning aircraft aside to make room for the next landing. It was a display of fanatical determination. The Allies watched this buildup with a growing sense of dread. They launched counterattacks, brave assaults by the New Zealanders and the British infantry, trying to retake the airfield. They fought through the olive groves and the vineyards, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat with bayonets and grenades. But the Germans now had the high ground on Hill 107. They rained machine gun fire down on the attackers. The Luftwaffe prowled the skies, smashing any concentration of Allied troops that dared to move in the open. The opportunity to crush the invasion had passed. The invincible airborne invasion had nearly failed, but it had survived by the skin of its teeth, and now it was growing stronger by the hour. Meanwhile, at sea, the Royal Navy was doing its utmost to stop the seaborne invasion force. The German plan included a flotilla of commandeered Greek fishing boats, cakes, loaded with heavy equipment and more troops, sailing from the mainland to support the paratroopers. The British fleet, led by Admiral Cunningham, intercepted this ragtag armada in the darkness. The destroyers and cruisers tore through the German convoy. It was a massacre at sea. The wooden fishing boats were smashed to pieces by heavy naval guns. Thousands of German soldiers drowned or were killed in the water. The seaborne invasion was completely repelled, but this victory at sea meant little to the men on the island. The battle for Crete was being decided on the dusty ground of Malim and in the skies above. The Germans, now reinforced with mountain troops and heavy mortars, began to push out from the airfield. They moved aggressively, using infiltration tactics, probing the Allied lines looking for weaknesses. The Allied troops were exhausted. They had been fighting without sleep, with little water, and under constant air attack. The command structure was fracturing. The confusion led to units being pulled back when they should have stood fast, and others standing fast when they were in danger of being surrounded. The retreat began to feel inevitable. It was not a rout, not yet, but a slow, grinding withdrawal. The roads leading east from Malim became clogged with walking wounded, stragglers, and trucks. It is important to visualize the soldiers' experience here. The dust was everywhere. It coated the inside of the mouth, grit grinding between teeth. The sun was a hammer. Lips were cracked and bleeding. Eyes were red-rimmed and vacant. The constant noise of the Stukas created a permanent state of flinching. Every time a shadow passed over the ground, men dived for cover. The fear of the air was absolute. In the midst of this, there were moments of profound human connection. A soldier sharing his last cigarette with a mate. A Cretan woman bringing a jug of water to a machine gun crew, ignoring the bullets zipping past. The shared look between men who know they are in a desperate situation, but are determined to do their duty. The Commonwealth troops, the Kiwis, the Ausses, the Brits, fought with a stubborn pride. They were professional soldiers, and they made the Germans pay for every yard of rocky ground. But the momentum had shifted. With Malium secure, the Germans could land light artillery and more supplies. They began to drive the Allies back towards Ceuta Bay. The defense of Crete was turning into a fighting retreat, a rerun of the campaign in Greece that had happened only weeks before. The tragedy was palpable. These men had thought they were safe on the island, a fortress in the sea. Now the fortress was crumbling from within. As the battle raged into its third and fourth days, the focus shifted to the town of Galatas and the prison valley. This was the key to Ceuta Bay. If the Germans broke through here, they would cut the Allied force in half. The fighting around Galatas was some of the most ferocious of the entire war. It was house to house, room to room fighting. The New Zealanders fixed bayonets catching the light, charged time and again to clear the Germans from the whitewashed houses. The Germans, for their part, were shocked by the resistance. They had been told the island would fall in a day. They had been told the British were demoralized. Instead, they found themselves fighting a determined enemy who refused to break. The German casualties were appalling. The paratrooper battalions had ceased to exist as effective fighting units. The burden of the offensive now lay with the mountain troops, tough men from the Austrian and Bavarian Alps who were used to hard terrain but were unused to the blistering heat of the Mediterranean. It was a clash of wills as much as a clash of arms. But the logistics were the deciding factor. The Allies were running out of ammunition. They were running out of food. And most critically, they were running out of hope. The Royal Navy, suffering heavy losses from German dive bombers while trying to resupply the island, could no longer operate freely in the waters north of Crete during daylight hours. The island was being strangled. By the 26th of May, General Freyberg faced the bitter reality. The situation was untenable. The Germans were growing stronger every day, while his own force was withering. To continue the fight would mean the annihilation of the entire garrison. He sent a message to Cairo, to the Middle East Command. It was a message that no commander ever wants to send. He requested permission to evacuate. The word evacuation is a heavy one. It implies failure. It implies leaving things behind. For the soldiers on the line who had fought so hard, the rumor of evacuation spread like a contagion. Some were relieved the nightmare would end. Others were angry, they felt they could still fight. But the order was given. The retreat to the south began. The geography of Crete now became the enemy. To evacuate, the troops had to cross the White Mountains to the southern coast, to the tiny fishing village of Sfakia, where the Navy would try to pick them up. The road to Sfakia was not really a road. It was a goat track, a winding, treacherous path that climbed over high passes and descended into steep gorges. The retreat was a march of misery. Thousands of men, disorganized, hungry, and thirsty, trudged up the mountain paths. They discarded their equipment as they walked. The roadside became a graveyard of military gear, trucks pushed over cliffs, rifles smashed against rocks, helmets rolling in the dust. The Germans followed, harassing the rearguard, their aircraft strafing the long columns of men exposed on the mountain slopes. But even in the retreat, there was heroism. Rearguard units, often composed of Australian and New Zealand battalions, stayed behind to hold the passes. They set up ambushes, forcing the Germans to deploy and fight, buying precious hours for their comrades to reach the sea. They knew that by staying behind, they were likely sacrificing their own chance of escape. They would be killed or captured, yet they stayed. They dug in among the rocks and waited for the gray uniforms to appear around the bend. As the main body of the troops reached the Ascafu Plain, a high plateau surrounded by peaks, they looked like an army of ghosts. Uniforms were in tatters. Boots were falling apart. Many men were barefoot, their feet cut and bleeding on the sharp stones. They walked in a daze, driven only by the primal instinct to survive, to reach the water to get off this cursed island. Down at Sfakia, the tiny harbor was a scene of desperation. The Royal Navy ships could only come in at night. During the day, the men hid in the caves and ravines that lined the coast, sheltering from the sun and the German planes. At night, the destroyers would glide in, silent shadows on the dark water. The organization of the boarding was difficult. Officers tried to maintain order, counting men onto the landing craft. Room for 50 more. Move up. Quickly, there was pushing and shoving. There was panic, but there was also discipline. Men stood in lines on the shingle beach, watching the boats fill up, knowing that there might not be room for them. They watched the white wakes of the ships disappearing into the darkness, carrying their friends to safety, while they were left on the shore to face another day of heat and bombing. Not everyone could go to Sfakia. The garrison at Heraklion was evacuated directly from the harbor there, a dangerous operation that saw heavy losses to the naval convoy from air attacks. The garrison at Retimo, however, was cut off. No order to retreat reached them in time. They were surrounded. They fought until they had no bullets left, and then they surrendered. A whole brigade of Australians, simply erased from the board. Back at Sfakia, the evacuation continued for 4 nights. The Navy pushed their luck to the limit, losing ships and men to save the army. But on the final night, the 1st of June, the admiral had to make the call. The ships were full. The risk was too great. The last boat pulled away. On the beach, thousands of men were left behind. They stood at the water's edge, watching the ships leave. The silence returned. They were abandoned. 5,000 men at Sfakia. They checked their weapons, realized the futility, and began to disable them. They sat down on the sand or in the caves and waited for the Germans to come down the hill. The Battle of Crete ended not with a bang, but with the quiet despair of captivity. It was a victory for the Germans, but a Pyrrhic one. They had captured the island, but the cost had been staggering. The Fallskirmjäger had suffered such high casualties that Hitler forbade any large-scale airborne operations for the rest of the war. The graveyard of the German paratroopers, they called it. For the Allies, it was a humiliating defeat, another evacuation, another retreat. But they had inflicted a deep wound on the enemy. They had destroyed the elite of the German army. As the sun rose on the morning of June the 1st, 1941, the island of Crete was quiet again. The roar of engines was gone. The dust began to settle. The olive trees stood still in the heat, their roots wrapped around the rocks, indifferent to the men who had fought and died beneath their branches. The war would move on to Russia, to North Africa, but the scars on the island and on the souls of the men who survived would remain forever. The silence that fell upon the beaches of Sfakia on the morning of June the 1st, 1941, was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of exhaustion. 5,000 men, the rearguard who had held the line while their comrades escaped, now stood amidst the flotsam of a wrecked army. They dropped their rifles into the sand or smashed the bolts against the rocks. They looked out at the empty horizon where the Royal Navy ships had vanished, and then they turned to face the cliffs. Coming down the goat tracks were the Germans, moving cautiously, their weapons raised. There was no final banzai charge, no last stand of cinematic glory. There was simply the raising of hands, the hollow look of defeat, and the beginning of a long, dark captivity. For these men, the war of movement was over, and the war of survival had begun. The Germans, though victorious, were in a foul temper. They had lost so many friends, so many brothers in the olive groves and on the rocky slopes. They looked at these tattered, sunburned British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers not just as defeated enemies, but as the men who had decimated their elite regiments. The treatment was harsh, the water was scarce, the heat was a physical weight. The prisoners were ordered to march. They had to walk back up the very mountains they had just descended during the retreat. It was a cruel reversal. The road from Sfakia to the north coast is steep, winding through the White Mountains, the Lefka Ori. Under the blazing June sun, without food, with lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, the column of prisoners stretched for miles. It became known as the Death March. Men who fell out of line were often beaten or simply left to die where they dropped. The Cretan civilians, watching from the roadside, tried to pass water and bread to the prisoners, risking being shot by the German guards. This act of kindness, this refusal to bow to the conqueror, was the first spark of a fire that would burn on Crete for the next 4 years. While the Allied soldiers were herded into makeshift prisoner of war camps, hastily erected barbed wire enclosures in the dust of the lowlands, a different kind of war was beginning in the villages. The German High Command was furious at the participation of the Cretan civilians in the fighting. In the strict, rigid Prussian military code, war was fought by soldiers in uniform. The idea of farmers, old men, and women taking up shotguns and pitchforks to kill paratroopers was seen as a violation of the rules of war, an act of franc-tireurs or illegal combatants. General Student, the commander whose career had been tarnished by the heavy losses, ordered reprisals. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated, bureaucratic massacres designed to terrify the population into submission. On June the 2nd, just a day after the surrender, a unit of paratroopers under the command of Lieutenant Trebes surrounded the village of Condamary. They gathered the men of the village, civilians ranging from teenagers to grandfathers, and marched them into an olive grove. The scene was documented by a German army photographer, capturing the terrifying calm of the villagers. They stood in the dappled sunlight, the leaves of the olive trees casting soft shadows on their shirts. They looked into the lenses of the cameras and the barrels of the rifles with a stoic, ancient dignity. Then the order was given. The volley rang out. The men fell. It was a brutal message to the people of Crete: resist and you will die. A similar fate befell the village of Candanos. The Germans razed it to the ground, dynamiting the houses, burning the crops, and killing the livestock. They left a wooden sign nailed to a post, written in German and Greek, stating that here stood Candanos, destroyed in retribution for the murder of German soldiers. They tried to erase the village from the map, but in doing so, they etched it forever into the memory of the island. Instead of breaking the spirit of the Cretans, these atrocities hardened it like steel tempered in fire. The Cretan people are a mountain people with a history of resisting invaders, Venetians, Ottomans, and now Germans. They possessed a deep cultural code of honor, philotimo, and a tradition of carrying arms. The survivors of the reprisals fled into the high mountains, into the inaccessible gorges and caves where the German trucks could not go. There they cleaned their old weapons, stole German ammunition, and formed bands of Andarts, the resistance fighters. But the resistance was not just Cretan. Scattered across the island were hundreds of Allied soldiers who had missed the surrender. They were hiding in caves, in monasteries, and in the attics of brave families. These men, British, Australians, New Zealanders, became known as the stragglers. They were hunted men. Posters went up in the towns offering rewards for their capture and threatening death to anyone caught harboring them. Yet the Cretans took them in. They shared their meager rations of bread and oil. They dyed the soldiers' uniforms with vegetable dyes to look like peasant clothes. They taught them a few words of Greek. They became brothers in the shadows. One needs to imagine the landscape of this hidden war. It was a war of silence and hearing. Up in the high pastures, amidst the limestone crags where the eagles circled, the air was thin and clear. The shepherds, looking like figures from the Old Testament in their black cloaks and knee-high leather boots, acted as the eyes and ears of the resistance. They watched the German patrols moving like toy soldiers on the roads far below. A signal would be passed, a mirror flash from a peak, a specific whistle, a runner moving with incredible speed over the loose scree. By the time the German patrol reached a mountain village, the British stragglers were gone, vanished into the landscape, and the village elders were sitting in the square, fingering their worry beads, looking innocent and confused. By the winter of 1941, the war in Europe had shifted. Hitler had turned his gaze east, launching Operation Barbarossa, the colossal invasion of the Soviet Union. Crete, which had been the center of the world's attention in May, became a backwater fortress. The elite paratroopers were largely withdrawn, sent to fight as infantry on the freezing Russian front, where they would die in the thousands. In their place, the occupation duty fell to second-rate garrison troops and the tough but overstretched mountain divisions. The island became a prison fortress, Festung Crete. The Germans built concrete bunkers along the coast, fearing a British counterinvasion that would never come. They laid minefields on the beaches. They improved the airfields, but they could never control the interior. The mountains belonged to the partisans. Into this stalemate stepped a new player, the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE. This was a secret organization formed by Winston Churchill with the mandate to set Europe ablaze. They realized that Crete, with its hostile terrain and fierce population, was the perfect breeding ground for guerrilla warfare. The first agents arrived not by parachute, but by sea. Submarines would surface in the dead of night in desolate coves on the south coast. Men wrapped in dark coats would paddle inflatable dinghies to the shore, carrying radio sets, gold sovereigns, and explosives. These agents were a breed apart. Many were scholars, archaeologists, or classicists who had studied ancient Greek at Oxford or Cambridge. They loved the island and its history. Men like Zan Fielding, Patrick Lee Fermer, and Monty Woodhouse. They did not come to lead vast armies. They came to coordinate. They lived in the caves with the shepherds. They grew beards and wore cretin breeches. They lice-ridden, hungry, and constantly cold. They moved between the rival resistance bands, trying to unite them against the common enemy. They set up radio posts high in the mountains, tapping out messages in Morse code to Cairo, calling for supply drops. The sound of a heavy aircraft engine at night became a sound of hope. A Halifax bomber, flying dangerously low through the mountain passes, would look for the signal fires arranged in a specific pattern on a plateau. Then the canisters would fall, cylindrical metal containers packed with Bren guns, Sten guns, plastic explosives, chocolate, and boots. The villagers would rush to retrieve them before the German patrols arrived, burying the parachutes to use as silk for wedding dresses later, and hiding the weapons in hollow trees or beneath floorboards. Life in the coastal cities, Chania, Heraklion, Retimo, was a grim contrast to the freedom of the mountains. Here, the swastika flew over the harbor offices. The Gestapo and the Feldgendarmerie, the military police with their metal gorgets, patrolled the streets. Food was rationed to starvation levels. The olive oil harvest was requisitioned for export to Germany. The bread was black and sawdust-heavy. People boiled weeds and snails to make soup. The feral cats disappeared from the alleys, ending up in cooking pots. Yet even here, resistance thrived. It was a resistance of intelligence. A network of spies watched every German move. The harbor master, who noted the arrival of supply ships. The cleaning lady in the German headquarters, who emptied the waste paper baskets and kept the crumpled notes. The bar owner who listened to the drunken gossip of off-duty soldiers. This information flowed up the mountains, to the radio sets, and then to Cairo. The British knew the schedule of the convoys often better than the German captains did. Royal Navy submarines and RAF bombers, armed with this intelligence, would lie in wait, sending tons of supplies destined for Rommel's Africa Corps to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The years dragged on. 1942, 1943, the tide of the war began to turn. The Germans were defeated at El Alamein in North Africa. The Allies landed in Sicily and Italy. Mussolini fell. The German garrison on Crete felt the walls closing in. They became more paranoid, more brutal. The reprisals continued. If a German truck was ambushed, 10 Cretans were shot. If an officer was killed, 50 were shot. It was in this atmosphere of escalating tension, in early 1944, that the SOE hatched one of the most audacious plans of the entire war. It was a plan born of a desire to humiliate the German occupation force and to boost the morale of the Cretan people. The target was not a bridge or a fuel dump. The target was a man, General Heinrich Krape, the commander of the 22nd Air Landing Division and recently appointed commander of Fortress Crete. The plan was devised by Major Patrick Lee Firmer and Captain William Stanley Moss. They were young, romantic, and utterly fearless. They proposed to kidnap a German general, snatch him from the midst of his own heavily guarded headquarters, and smuggle him off the island to Cairo. It sounded like fiction. The brass in Cairo were skeptical, but they gave the green light. In February 1944, Firmer and Moss boarded a bomber in Cairo. They were to parachute onto the Lassithi Plateau in eastern Crete. But the weather was foul. Clouds obscured the drop zone. They tried again and again. Finally, Firmer jumped alone, disappearing into the swirling mist. Moss had to return to Cairo and come in later by boat. Firmer landed in the snow. He was found by the resistance and hidden. For weeks, he lived in the caves, reconnecting with his old friends among the Andarts, preparing the ground. He was a man who could recite Greek poetry by the fire, drink raki with the toughest mountain chieftains, and plan a military operation with precise detail. When Moss finally arrived by sea, landing on a rocky beach at night, the team was complete. They moved west, crossing the island on foot, dodging patrols. They gathered a small team of Cretan partisans, men they trusted with their lives. They needed a place to strike. They watched General Krape's routine. He lived in the Villa Ariadne at Knossos, the site of the ancient Minoan palace, and drove every morning to his headquarters in Anno Archanes. The road was winding and guarded, but there was one junction, a T-junction near the village of Archanes, where the general's car had to slow down. On the night of April the 26th, 1944, the trap was set. It was a dark, moonless night. Firmer and Moss dressed in stolen German corporal uniforms. They stood in the middle of the road at the junction, holding red traffic batons. The rest of the team hid in the ditch. The crickets were chirping loudly, masking the sound of their breathing. Headlights cut through the darkness. A large black Opel Admiral staff car approached. It was the general. The pennants on the fenders fluttered in the breeze. Firmer stepped out, raising his baton. The car slowed. The driver, unsuspecting, believing this was a routine checkpoint, braked. As the car came to a halt, the world exploded into action. Firmer tore open the passenger door. Moss tore open the driver's door. They dragged the driver out and knocked him unconscious. Firmer jumped into the back seat, pressing a pistol into General Krape's side. "Do not move," he said in German. "You are a prisoner of the British Army." Moss jumped into the driver's seat. The Cretan partisans wrestled the driver into the back of the car. Within seconds, the vehicle was moving again, accelerating down the road. They were now driving a German general's car, with the general inside, straight toward the heart of the German occupation zone in Heraklion. It was madness. They had to pass through 22 German checkpoints to reach the safety of the mountains on the other side of the city. The tension in the car was electric. Every time they saw a flashlight waving in the dark, Moss would slow down. Firmer and Moss would salute smartly. The German sentries, seeing the general's flags and the officers inside, would snap to attention and wave them through. They drove right through the center of Heraklion, past the cinema where German troops were queuing for a movie, past the Gestapo headquarters. General Krape sat in stunned silence, a pistol pressed against his ribs, watching his own troops salute his kidnappers. Once they were clear of the city, they ditched the car near a submarine pickup point on the coast to leave a false trail. They left a note inside, carefully written, claiming full responsibility for the British force to ensure no reprisals would be taken against the civilians. They claimed the general had been taken off the island immediately by submarine. In reality, they were just beginning a grueling trek up into the glories of Mount Ida, the highest mountain on Crete. The hunt was on. The Germans were apoplectic. Fieseler Storch spotter planes buzzed over the mountains like angry wasps. Patrols scoured the valleys. Thousands of troops were deployed to find the missing general. But Firmer, Moss, and their captive were moving through the wildest terrain in Europe. They climbed through snow-covered passes, slept in goat folds, and ate cheese and wild greens. There is a famous moment from this journey that captures the strange, surreal nature of the war on Crete. One morning at dawn, while gazing at the peak of Mount Ida, General Crete muttered a line in Latin from an ode by Horace. Patrick Lee Firmer, the scholar soldier, immediately completed the stanza. The German general looked at the British officer in disguise, and for a moment the war fell away. They were just two educated men acknowledging the beauty of the morning. "Ach so, Herr Major," Crete said. "You know it too." Finally, after weeks of evading capture, crossing the entire island from north to south, they reached the extraction beach near Radicino. On the night of May the 14th, the signals were flashed. A motor launch from the Royal Navy glided in. The general, the officers, and the Cretan partisans waded into the surf. They were hauled aboard. The engines roared, and the boat turned south toward Egypt. The kidnapping of General Crete did not change the outcome of the war. It did not liberate Crete. In fact, despite the note left in the car, the Germans did exact terrible reprisals on the villages in the Amory Valley. But as a symbol, it was powerful. It proved that the Germans were not invincible. It proved that they were not safe, even in their own headquarters. It humiliated the occupation force and gave the Cretan people a story that would be told for generations. But the war was not over. The German garrison on Crete, now isolated and cut off as the Allies advanced through Europe, remained stubborn. They retreated into a fortified perimeter around Chania, creating a siege within a siege. The rest of the island was effectively liberated by the Andarts, but the Germans held the capital and the main port until the very bitter end. The winter of 1944 turned into the spring of 1945. Berlin fell. Hitler committed suicide. The war in Europe ended on May the 8th, 1945. But on Crete, a strange anomaly occurred. The German commander, General Benthak, refused to surrender to the Greek guerrillas, fearing a massacre. He would only surrender to a British general. But there was no British general on the island. So a surreal situation developed where the German troops, fully armed, continued to patrol their perimeter, waiting for the British to arrive to accept their surrender. Finally, a small British force was flown in. On May the 9th, 1945, in a villa in Heraklion, the surrender was signed. The German occupation of Crete, which had begun with the roar of Junkers' engines 4 years earlier, ended with the scratch of a pen. The cost had been enormous. The island was devastated. Villages were ruins. The male population of entire regions had been decimated. Thousands of Cretans had died from execution, hunger, or in combat. The Jewish community of Crete had been rounded up and put on a ship, the Tanais, which was sunk by a British submarine. A tragic accident of war that wiped out a community with roots going back 2,000 years. The Allied soldiers who had been left behind, those who survived the camps, returned home as changed men. They carried with them the trauma of the surrender, the brutality of the camps, but also the memory of the extraordinary kindness of the Cretan peasants. As the ships carrying the German prisoners finally left the harbors of Suda and Heraklion, the people of Crete came down from the mountains. They rebuilt their stone houses. They replanted the olive trees. The cicadas continued to sing in the heat, just as they had on the morning of the invasion. The rusty hulks of the gliders and the transport planes were slowly stripped for metal or overgrown by vines, becoming part of the landscape. The Battle of Crete was a unique chapter in the Second World War. It was the only time a strategic island was taken entirely by air. It was the first time the German populace encountered mass resistance from a civilian population. And it forged a bond between the people of Crete and the Anzac and British that remains to this day. If you walk through the war cemetery at Suda Bay, looking at the rows of white headstones against the blue water, you will see fresh flowers. They are placed there not just by tourists, but by the locals. They remember. They remember the sky turning black with planes. They remember the hunger. And they remember the men who stood with them when the world seemed to be falling apart. To understand the full scope of the tragedy and the triumph of Crete, one must look beyond the shores of the island itself. The surrender in May 1941 was not an end, but a fracturing of timelines. For the thousands of men left on the beaches, the war transformed from a chaotic battle for survival into a long, gray endurance of captivity. For the survivors who reached Egypt, it became a burning desire for redemption in the deserts of North Africa. And for the commanders in Berlin and London, the battle became a lesson written in blood that would dictate the strategies of the future. Let us first follow the Lost Legion, the 11,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners of war. Their journey into the heart of the Third Reich began with a humiliation designed to break them. They were marched from the collection points at Sfakia and the airfields back through the ruined towns they had failed to defend. They were paraded through Athens, ragged, bearded, and emaciated, a spectacle for the cameras of the German propaganda ministry. But the Athenians did not jeer. Instead, they threw flowers, cigarettes, and food from their balconies, defying the bayonets of the guards to honor the men who had fought for their freedom. The journey north was a nightmare of logistics and cruelty. The men were packed into cattle trucks, the infamous 40 and 8 boxcars, 40 men or 8 horses. There was no room to lie down. There was no sanitation. The heat of the Greek summer turned the wooden boxes into ovens. As the trains rattled slowly through the Balkans, through Yugoslavia and Austria, the men suffered from dysentery and thirst. They were heading toward the stalags, the enlisted men's camps that dotted the landscape of Germany and Poland like a rash. Life behind the wire in camps like Stalag 8B or Stalag 7 was a war of a different kind. It was a war against monotony. A soldier in battle runs on adrenaline. A prisoner runs on memory and hope. The days were measured in roll calls, appel, standing for hours in the freezing dawn while German guards counted and recounted. The food was a watery soup made from turnip tops or rotten potatoes, and a heavy, sawdust-filled black bread that the men called skilly. Yet, the spirit that had held the line at Galatas did not evaporate behind barbed wire. The camps became hives of industry and subversion. The men organized themselves. They created universities, teaching each other languages, mathematics, and law. They formed theatrical societies, putting on elaborate plays with costumes made from Red Cross parcel packing and blankets. They built radios from stolen scraps of wire and crystals, listening to the news from the BBC, plotting the movement of the front lines on secret maps hidden in the hollow legs of tables. And they escaped. The story of the prisoners of Crete is filled with audacious attempts to reclaim freedom. Men jumped from the moving trains in the mountains of Greece, joining the local resistance or trying to walk hundreds of miles to neutral Turkey. Inside the camps, they dug tunnels. They forged papers. They sewed civilian clothes. It was a constant battle of wits against the goons, as they called the guards. For every man who made it home, 100 were recaptured, sent to solitary confinement or shot. But the act of resisting, even in captivity, preserved their dignity. While the prisoners began their long wait, the survivors of the evacuation were arriving in Alexandria, Egypt. They stepped off the Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers looking like men from another world. They were filthy, some wearing only shorts and boots, their eyes hollow with the 1,000-yard stare. They were angry. There was a deep bitterness toward the Royal Air Force, which they felt had abandoned them. "Tell us where the RAF is," they would sneer in the bars of Cairo, unaware of the desperate odds the pilots had faced. But armies, like living organisms, heal and adapt. General Freyberg, the old lion, refused to let defeat define his division. The New Zealanders, along with the Australians and British, were re-equipped. They traded their mountain gear for desert fatigues. They learned to fight not in olive groves and ravines, but in the vast, open ocean of sand that was the Western Desert. The veterans of Crete carried a hardness with them. They had seen the worst the Germans could throw at them, the elite paratroopers, the Stukas, and they had survived. When they met the Germans again at El Alamein, the memory of Crete was the fuel for their fire. They knew the enemy was not invincible. They had seen him bleed. On the strategic level, the Battle of Crete cast a long shadow over the rest of the war. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was shaken. The casualties suffered by the 7th Flieger Division were appalling to him. Of the 22,000 German soldiers deployed, over 6,000 were killed or wounded. The cream of his youth, the most fanatical and physically fit soldiers of the Reich, had been decimated. After the battle, Hitler summoned General Student to the Wolf's Lair. He did not congratulate him on a great victory. Instead, he reportedly said, "The day of the parachutist is over. The parachute weapon is a weapon of surprise. That surprise has now been used up. It was a decision of immense consequence." For the rest of the war, the German paratroopers fought primarily as elite ground infantry. They never launched another major airborne invasion. Had they preserved their strength, they might have been used to seize Malta, the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean that choked Rommel's supply lines. By breaking the airborne arm on the rocks of Crete, the Allies had unknowingly saved Malta, and by extension, perhaps even the Suez Canal. There is also the question of time. History is a game of inches and seconds. The Battle of Crete delayed the German timetable for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, by several weeks. The exact impact is debated by historians. Some say the delay was due to weather, others insist the diversion of aircraft and transport to Greece and Crete was the critical factor. But if Crete bought even a few weeks of time, pushing the German advance closer to the inevitable Russian winter, then the sacrifice of the defenders was not in vain. The mud and snow that froze the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow in December 1941 was an ally that had been bought with the time consumed in the Mediterranean spring. Back on the island, the occupation settled into a grim routine, but it also became a bizarre cultural collision. The German occupiers, many of whom were educated men, officers of the old school, found themselves fascinated by the history of the place. They were conquerors standing in the ruins of the Minoan civilization. There were instances of German officers engaging in amateur archaeology, digging for pottery shards in the same soil where they had ordered executions. The resistance, however, never allowed them to rest. The kidnapping of General Crete was the headline event, but the daily grind was a war of sabotage. The Andarts, the guerrilla fighters, became masters of the ambush. They would mine the roads, cut the telephone wires, and snipe at sentries. The landscape aided them. The White Mountains are a fortress of nature. A man who knows the goat paths can move 3 times faster than a man on a road. But the resistance was not a monolith. As the war dragged on, the political fractures of Greece began to bleed into the fight. The communist-backed Hellas and the nationalist Iria began to view each other with as much suspicion as they viewed the Germans. It was a prelude to the tragic Greek Civil War that would erupt after the liberation. The British SOE agents, men like Monty Woodhouse and Patrick Leigh Fermor, found themselves acting as diplomats as much as soldiers, trying to keep the guns of the Greeks pointed at the Germans rather than at each other. There were unsung heroes in the Shadow War. The abbots and monks of the ancient monasteries, like the Provelli Monastery on the south coast, played a crucial role. Provelli became a sanctuary for stragglers and agents. The monks, men of peace, fed the soldiers and hid them in the cellars, right under the noses of the German patrols. When the Germans discovered this, they ransacked the monastery, destroying centuries-old icons and relics, but the spirit of the place remained unbroken. One cannot tell the story of Crete without mentioning the sheer physical toll on the island itself. The bombing had flattened the harbors. The ancient Venetian fortifications of Heraklion and Chania were scarred. The economy was destroyed. The olive trees, the lifeblood of the island, had gone unharvested or had been burned. The livestock had been eaten. When the liberation finally came in 1945, the Cretans were destitute. They had no shoes, no cloth, no oil. Yet when the first British relief ships arrived, the people did not ask for charity. They asked for weapons to finish the job, and then they asked for seed to replant their fields. The post-war years were difficult. The island, like the rest of Greece, was plunged into a civil war that tore families apart. But as the decades passed, a strange alchemy took place. The bitterness of the war began to soften into memory. The German war cemetery at Meilim is a place of profound quiet. It sits on a hill, looking out over the airfield where so many young men died before they touched the ground. The graves are marked with flat stones, thousands of them. In the 1960s and 70s, the veterans began to return, not as soldiers, but as old men with tourists' cameras. The New Zealanders and Australians came back to find the slip trenches they had dug 30 years before. They went to the villages where they had been given water by a frightened woman, or where they had hidden in a barn. And amazing scenes occurred. They would walk into a tavern in a mountain village, gray-haired and stooped, and a local elder would look at them, recognition dawning in his eyes. Embraces, tears, and the pouring of raki would follow. The bond forged in 1941 had not rusted. The Germans came back too. Former paratroopers, now businessmen and grandfathers, visited the graves of their comrades. They met the men they had fought against. In the shared silence of the cemeteries, the animosity faded, replaced by a mutual understanding of the horror they had both endured. The legacy of the Battle of Crete is etched into the identity of the Anzac nations. Along with Gallipoli, it stands as a testament to the endurance of their soldiers in impossible situations. But unlike Gallipoli, which was a static trench war, Crete was a dynamic, chaotic collision of old and new warfare. It showed the vulnerability of naval power to air power. It showed the limits of airborne assault. And it showed that a civilian population, armed with courage and knowledge of their land, could deny the occupier true control. For the listener standing on the hill of Galatas today, the wind still blows through the olive trees with a dry, rustling sound. The cicadas still drone in the summer heat. The white mountains still loom jagged and purple in the distance. It is a beautiful, harsh landscape. If you listen closely to the silence, you can almost hear the faint echo of the Ju-52 engines, the crack of the Lee Enfield rifles, and the voices of young men from opposite ends of the earth, forever bound together by the events of those 10 days in May. The fall of Crete was not an isolated tragedy. It was a heavy stone dropped into the middle of the Mediterranean, sending ripples that crashed against every shore of the war. To fully grasp the weight of the events of May 1941, and to understand the journey of the men who survived the olive groves and the mountain passes, we must follow those ripples west, toward a small, yellow rock sitting alone in the sea. That rock was Malta. If Crete was the graveyard of the German paratroopers, Malta was intended to be their next conquest. It sits right in the center of the shipping lanes, a stationary aircraft carrier made of limestone, barely larger than a city. From its airfields, British bombers could strangle the supply lines of the German army in North Africa. General Rommel, the Desert Fox, knew that for him to conquer Egypt, Malta had to be neutralized. The logic of war dictated that after Crete, the airborne armada would descend on Malta. Operation Hercules, the invasion plan, was drawn up. The gliders were ready. The paratroopers, those who were left, were on standby. But the ghosts of Crete stood in the way. Hitler, haunted by the reports of the slaughter at Meilim and Galatas, hesitated. He looked at the map of Malta, with its stone walls and dense fortifications, and he saw another massacre. He blinked. Instead of an invasion, he ordered a siege. He decided to crush the island from the air and starve it from the sea. So the survivors of the Luftwaffe squadrons that had terrorized the defenders of Crete, the Stukas, the Junkers 88s, were moved to Sicily, just 20 minutes flying time from Malta. The assault that followed makes the bombardment of Crete look like a skirmish. For 2 years, Malta became the most bombed place on Earth. The sirens wailed so often that they became the background music of daily life. The architecture of the island, built by the Knights of St. John specifically to withstand sieges, was pulverized. The limestone dust, fine and choking, coated everything. It turned the hair of the women gray, it coated the food. It filled the lungs of the children who lived in underground tunnels cut into the soft rock. For the British submarines and aircraft operating from the island, it was a war of nerves. The submariners, some of whom had helped evacuate the troops from Sfakia, would slip out of the Grand Harbor at night. They hunted the Italian and German convoys heading to Libya. It was a claustrophobic, terrifying game. The Mediterranean is clear and shallow compared to the Atlantic. A submarine can be seen from the air, even when submerged. When the destroyers came hunting, the depth charges would crack the hulls and burst the eardrums of the crews. Yet they kept sailing, strangling Rommel's fuel supplies, ensuring that the tanks in the desert would run dry. The connection between the men of Crete and the defense of Malta is one of shared suffering and strategic balance. Because the Allies had inflicted such damage on the German transport fleet and airborne corps in Crete, the invasion of Malta never came. The island held out, battered and starving but free. And because Malta held out, the supplies to North Africa were cut. And because the supplies were cut, the British Army in Egypt was given a fighting chance. Let us now shift our focus to that British Army, the Eighth Army, gathering its strength in the deserts of Egypt and Libya. This is where the story of the Crete veterans continues. The men who had been evacuated, the New Zealanders, the Australians, the British infantry, did not go home. They were re-equipped in the vast base camps of the Nile Delta. They traded their woolen battle dress for khaki shorts and open-neck shirts. They learned to live with a new enemy, the desert itself. The Western Desert is a place of extremes. In the day, the heat is a physical blow, shimmering off the hardpan and the sand dunes. It cooks the inside of a tank until the metal burns the skin. The flies are a plague, swarming around eyes and mouths, covering every scrap of food the moment a tin is opened. At night, the temperature plummets, and men shiver under their greatcoats. It is a clean, sterile landscape, devoid of the complex terrain of Crete. There are no olive trees to hide behind, no ravines. It is a tactician's dream and a soldier's nightmare, a flat board where movement is life and stillness is death. The men from Crete brought a hardness to this theater. They had learned the sound of the German Spandau machine gun. They knew the terror of the dive bomber. They had a score to settle. The New Zealand Division, under General Freyberg, became one of the most feared units in the desert. They were used as a shock force, a mobile sledgehammer. One of the most defining chapters of this desert war, which ran parallel to the occupation of Crete, was the siege of Tobruk. Here, the Australian 9th Division, the Rats of Tobruk, dug in and held a vital port against the entire weight of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Like the defenders of Heraklion, they were surrounded. Like the defenders of Retimo, they were cut off. But unlike in Crete, they had artillery support and they had tanks. They lived in holes in the ground, enduring constant shelling and bombing. They raided the German lines at night, silent patrols moving with knives and bayonets, terrifying the Italian and German infantry. They proved that the German blitzkrieg could be stopped if men simply refused to move. But the Desert War was not just about static defense. It was a war of movement, a pendulum swinging back and forth across hundreds of miles of emptiness. The armies would clash, exhaust themselves, and retreat, only to build up and attack again. Gazala, Burhakim, Mursa strange names on a map that became soaked in blood. It was in this vast, open crucible that a new kind of warfare was born, one that had its spiritual roots in the irregular fighting on Crete. The Special Air Service, the SAS, was formed by David Stirling in the desert. Stirling realized that small teams of highly trained men operating behind enemy lines could do more damage than a battalion of infantry. Using jeeps mounted with twin Vickers K machine guns, they would drive deep into the desert, navigating by the stars like sailors. They would sweep onto German airfields at night, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground, blowing up fuel dumps, and disappearing back into the dunes before the sun rose. This was the same spirit of the Andarts in the mountains of Crete, but mechanized and unleashed on a grand scale. The climax of this desert saga, and the moment where the defeat of Crete was finally avenged, came at a railway halt called El Alamein. In October 1942, the two armies faced each other. Rommel, starved of fuel because of the submarines from Malta, had dug in. General Montgomery, the new British commander, had built up a massive force of artillery and tanks. The Crete veterans were there, in the vanguard. On the night of October the 23rd, the sky over the desert turned white. 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. The noise was heard in Alexandria, 60 miles away. It was the largest artillery barrage since the First World War. The ground shook. The New Zealanders, the Australians, the Highlanders, and the South Africans rose from their trenches. They walked into the minefields, into the teeth of the German defenses. The Battle of El Alamein was a grinder. It was not a battle of maneuver, but a battle of attrition, a crumbling operation as Montgomery called it. For days, the infantry fought through the minefields, clearing a path for the tanks. It was brutal, close-quarters work. But this time the Allies had air superiority. This time it was the Germans who looked up to see the sky filled with enemy bombers. This time it was the Germans who ran out of ammunition. When the breakthrough finally came and the German army began to retreat west, it was the beginning of the end for the Axis in Africa. The bells rang in England for the first time in the war. Winston Churchill famously said, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." For the survivors of Crete, El Alamein was a vindication. They had driven the enemy back. They had proven that the German war machine could be broken. But their journey was not over. The war would take them across the sea again, to Sicily, and then up the rugged spine of Italy. The Italian campaign was, in many ways, a return to the conditions of Crete. The mountains, the stone villages, the cold rain, the mules carrying supplies up steep tracks. At Monte Cassino, the New Zealanders found themselves once again facing their old enemies, the German paratroopers. The 1st Parachute Division, reformed and refitted after their mauling in Crete, held the monastery at Cassino. It was a grudge match of epic proportions. The two elite units who had first met in the olive groves of Malim now fought each other in the rubble of an ancient abbey. The fighting was savage. No quarter was asked, and none was given. While the armies clashed in the sunlight, the shadow war in the Mediterranean continued to evolve. We must look at the tragedy of the Greek islands in 1943, specifically the Dodecanese campaign. After the surrender of Italy, the British tried to seize the islands of Kos, Leros, and Samos. It was a mini-Crete all over again. The British sent in troops, but they lacked air cover. The Luftwaffe reacted with ferocious speed. They bombed the islands into submission. On Leros, the British defenders were subjected to another airborne assault. Once again, they were overwhelmed. It was a bitter lesson that the Allies seemed to have to learn twice. Without control of the air, islands are just traps. But let us return to the human element, to the individual soldier whose life threads through these great events. Picture a man we shall call Thomas. Thomas was a 20-year-old from a sheep farm in the South Island of New Zealand when he landed on Crete. He fought at Galatas, used his bayonet, saw his best friend die, and trekked over the mountains to Sfakia. He was one of the lucky ones. He got on a boat. Thomas spent a year in the desert. He learned to drink tea that tasted of petrol. He learned to sleep in a hole in the sand while shells burst around him. He fought at El Alamein, walking through the minefields with a Bren gun on his hip. He went to Italy. He fought in the streets of Trieste at the very end of the war. When Thomas finally went home in 1946, he was 25 years old, but he looked 40. He went back to the sheep farm. He rarely spoke of the war. He kept his medals in a tin box in the wardrobe. But every year on Anzac Day, he would go to the local hall, drink beer with the other men, and they would talk. They wouldn't talk about strategy or generals. They would talk about the thirst. They would talk about the dust. They would talk about the cretins. There is a profound connection between the soldier and the land he fights on. For the Anzac, Crete became a second spiritual home. It was the place where they had been tested to the limit. The bond was reciprocal. In the decades after the war, when travel became easier, a strange phenomenon occurred. The children of the soldiers began to visit Crete. They went to find the caves where their fathers had hidden. They went to find the families who had fed them. And the Cretan families were waiting. The tradition of hospitality, philoxenia, is sacred in Greece. When a young New Zealander or Australian walked into a village and said, "My father was here in 41, the doors opened. The tables were laid. The stories were retold. It became a pilgrimage. The legacy of the battle also lives on in the military academies of the world. The Battle of Crete is studied as a textbook example of vertical envelopment, but also as a case study in the importance of communication and initiative. Young officers learn how Colonel Andrews' hesitation on Hill 107 changed the course of history. They learn how the failure to destroy the runway at Malim allowed the Germans to reinforce. It is a lesson in the fragility of plans. No plan survives contact with the enemy, as the old saying goes, and nowhere was this truer than on Crete. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the story of the resistance. In a world that was rapidly becoming mechanized and impersonal, where death was dealt from 30,000 feet or from miles away by artillery, the Cretan resistance was personal. It was a man defending his doorstep. It was a woman defending her children. It was a reminder that the will to be free is a weapon that cannot be manufactured in a factory. The story of the abduction of General Crape, which we touched upon earlier, became a legend that transcended the war. It was immortalized in books and films, portrayed as a romantic adventure. But for the people of the Amory Valley who suffered the reprisals, it was a memory of ash and blood. It raises the difficult moral questions of resistance warfare. Is the capture of one general worth the destruction of 3 villages? The historians can debate it in the safety of their studies, but the people who lived it had to carry the weight of that equation. As we move further away from the mid-20th century, the voices of the survivors are fading. The last of the veterans have passed away. The Cretan villagers who remembered the German occupation are gone. We are left with the archives, the photographs, the rusted metal in the museums, and the stories. That is why we tell them. We tell them to remember that history is not a list of dates. It is the sensory experience of human beings placed in extreme circumstances. It is the smell of wild thyme mixed with cordite. It is the sound of a Stuka siren. It is the taste of a stolen orange shared between a starving soldier and a terrified child. The Mediterranean today is a place of tourism. Cruise ships dock in Ceuta Bay, close to where the cruisers of the Royal Navy were bombed. Planes full of vacationers land at Heraklion and Chania airports, the very airfields that were the prizes of 1941. The beaches where men died are now lined with umbrellas and suns. But if you go to the Hill of Galatas at sunset, or walk the Gorge of Imbros where the retreat took place, the landscape remembers. The rocks are the same, the light is the same, and if you know the story, if you have listened to the voices of the past, you can see the ghosts. You can see the parachutes blossoming in the sky like white flowers. You can see the weary line of men walking south. You can see the fishing boats slipping out into the dark water. The war was a global catastrophe, a grinding clash of ideologies and empires. But in the end, it was fought by individuals. It was fought by Thomas from New Zealand, by Hans from Hamburg, by Manolis from Crete. Each of them believed they were doing what was right, or what was necessary. Each of them was a son, a father, a brother. The Battle of Crete and its aftermath in the Mediterranean theater stands as a testament to the complexity of human courage. It showed us the best and the worst of us. the brutality of the firing squads, and the nobility of the self-sacrifice, the arrogance of the commanders, and the resilience of the common soldier. As we conclude this journey through the history of the Mediterranean War, we leave the island of Crete behind. We leave it in peace, floating in the turquoise sea, a stone ship carrying a heavy cargo of memory. The guns are silent. The wind blows from Africa, warm and dry. The story is told. This brings our narrative of the events of 1941 and their consequences to a close. The history books are filled with more battles, more campaigns, but few have the haunting, tragic beauty of the Battle of Crete.